Welcome, everyone. Even if you're still getting a cup of coffee, it might be much needed. So welcome to this circle. We are this community of Southminster Steinhauer, and we come, whether we come each week, or we come once in a while, or whether this is our first time here, this circle is for you. And you're part of this circle, and you're part of this community for us today, and we welcome you. This is a safe place for all to gather. It's a place where we have gratitude for each person here, and for all our ancestors that have been here before us, the ones we grieve, the ones we mourn, the ones we never met, the ones who held this land long before us. And so we give gratitude for the long history of people with whom we share this spiritual journey. And we gather here in their footsteps and tracing new ones as we move forward. As we gather each time in this circle, we recognize that our hearts and our minds are always in new and different places. We might be experiencing a joyous week. We might have heavy hearts. We might have come from extreme busyness, or we might be in a place of calm and serenity. Regardless of where we come from and what we've experienced, we come into this place to be with each other, to feel a sense of refreshment, to ponder wisdom for our living. So in that spirit, may we work toward not only getting here, but being fully here. Let's sing together. We've been engaging in a series of Sundays over the last few months that speak about all the challenges and sidetracks that we find on the spiritual journey. This morning, we speak about one that has been on many people's hearts over the past weeks. We talk about the sidetrack and the challenge of fear. As we speak about that today, and we ponder wisdom around the topic of fear and the way it moves us away from the positive spiritual life that we seek, we light this candle. We light this candle as we seek alternative ways to living. We light this candle as a reminder that in the heart of spiritual community, and on the path of spiritual enlightenment, there is a place for us to walk in hope. Hope of life and life abundant. Hope of a world that might see through the guises of fear toward something positive, something hopeful, something in which we might value and give our lives. It's in this spirit that we speak to that hope, and we gather in our time for reflection.
Two weeks ago, at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, 49 people were murdered because they were gay, and 53 others are permanently scarred for the same reason. The LGBTQ community, which spans the globe, has been left feeling vulnerable and hurt, not just by the massacre itself, but by some of the unkind reactions of others to the event. The rainbow flag has been a symbol of our community since 1978, when Harvey Milk, the first openly gay politician, asked Gilbert Baker to come up with a symbol of gay pride for the San Francisco Gay Pride Parade in June of that year. When Harvey Milk was assassinated 5 months later, demand for rainbow flags became worldwide, and it became the symbol of gay pride for all of us. It's believed that Gilbert Baker was inspired by Judy Garland's rendition of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And so I share that with you this morning for Music for Meditation, in honor of the victims of the Orlando shooting and a wounded community.
Into this place, we gather seeking truth, listening beyond words for the rhythm of all that is sacred. We gather seeking solace for losses that are heavy to bear. We gather seeking mercy, for we find within our own hearts the presence of shadow. We gather seeking justice, for we find too We gather to share, for there are things in our lives we've found to be true. We gather to heal, for we can shoulder burdens that aren't our own. We gather to forgive, freeing each other into hope and renewal. We gather to stand shoulder to shoulder, for no one should stand alone. Into this place we come as those who walk a common road. Our first piece of wisdom this morning comes from Dr. Seuss. So do I. It's entitled, "What Was I Scared of?" Well, I was walking in the night and I saw nothing scary, for I have never been afraid of anything. Not very. Then I was deep within the woods when suddenly I spied them. I saw a pair of pale green pants with nobody inside them. I wasn't scared, but yet I stopped. What could those pants be there for? What could a pair of pants at night be standing in the air for? And then they moved, those empty pants. They kind of started jumping. And then my heart, I must admit, it kind of started thumping. So I got out fast as I could go, sir. I wasn't scared, but pants like that I did not care for. No, sir. After that, a week went by. Then one dark night in Greenwich, I had to do an errand there and fetch some Greenwich spinach. Well, I'd fetched the spinach. I was starting back through town when those pants raced round a corner and they almost knocked me down. I lost my Greenwich spinach, but I didn't even care. I ran for home, believe me. I'd really had a scare. Now, bicycles were never made for pale green pants to ride 'em, especially spooky pale green pants with nobody inside 'em. And the next night, I was fishing for doubt trout on Ruver River. When those pants came rowing toward me, well, I started into shiver. And by now I was so frightened that I'll tell you, but I hate to. I screamed and rowed away and lost my hook and line and bait too. I ran and found a brickle bush. I hid myself away. I got brickles in my britches, but I stayed there anyway. I stayed all night, the next night too. I'd be there still, no doubt, but I had to do an errand, so the next night I went out. Yes, I had to do an errand, had to pick a peck of snide in a dark and gloomy snide field that was almost 9 miles wide. I said I do not fear those pants with nobody inside them. I said and said and said those words. I said them, but I lied them. Then I reached inside a snide bush, and the next thing I knew, I felt my hand touch someone, and I'll bet you know who. And there I was, caught in the snide, and in that dreadful place, those spooky, empty pants and I were standing face to face. I yelled for help. I screamed, I shrieked, I howled, I yowled, I cried. Oh, save me from these pale green pants with nobody inside. But then a strange thing happened why those pants began to cry. Those pants began to tremble. They were just as scared as I. I never heard such whimpering, and I began to see that I was just as strange to them as they were strange to me. I put my arm around their waist and sat right down beside them. I calmed them down. Poor empty pants with nobody inside them. And now we meet quite often, those empty pants and I, and we never shake or tremble. We both smile, and we say hi. These are words of a wise children's author. May we find wisdom for our living.
A reading from Mark 4, verses 35 to 41. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe. This is a story from the first century Jesus tradition. May we find wisdom for our living.
I feel like I start out like the character in our Dr. Seuss story when I think about fear. I think, well, there's not many things I fear, not many. I think the few moments before a roller coaster ride begins. I think the thought of the thought of loss or tragedy in my family. I think anything with more than 8 legs. Those are a few, not necessarily in order. Fear is a very powerful thing in our lives, and it prompts us to seek. It has a positive side to it, obviously. It helps us to seek protection. I'm not going to get in a tub of plus 8-legged creatures. It motivates us into needed changes and surprising adventures. It serves us as a constant reminder also that we're fragile, that we're limited, that we're human. But on the other side of these impulses, we know fear also prompts us to do other things, like lock our doors, lock the doors not only of our homes but of our lives, to the mystery and wonder of the unknown, and run into places of isolated hiding. Very few emotions are stronger than fear. Fear shows itself behind every act of violence. Fear shows itself in every hateful word and act of terror. It reveals itself as the motivation behind every decision that chooses to isolate, to limit freedom, to blame another person. Fear thrusts us into categories of us and them, of good and bad, of safe and threatening. And fear, it seems, is taking its spotlight at the moment in our world. And true, it always threatens from the edges. But it seems like world events in the past few weeks have seen fear get its share of glory. Mass shootings from a man full of hate, or confusion, or anger, or religious extremism, or all of these poured together in some toxic concoction. An American presidential candidate that relies on bigotry and hatred as a motivation for his own personal definition of greatness. A Brexit vote that at its heart played on the fear of the other, of the need for more safety, and the sense of security one might feel in closing one's doors and erecting walls and going it alone. Now, in all of these larger-than-life examples, but also in the 100 small ways that fear inserts its slippery tendrils into our own days and decisions, we recognize it as a sidetrack from a good and healthy, positive spiritual life. I want to turn to this story. This story from our Christian tradition, a story in which a storm is ready to engulf Jesus and his friends, that it keeps getting worse and worse, and where is the leader? Asleep in the stern of the boat. And I'm fascinated by this story because they might have yelled out something like, "Don't just lie there, you idiot, bail!" But they didn't. Now, these stories get cleaned up over the centuries, so maybe they did. Instead, they attacked him personally. They said, "Teacher, don't you care that we're dying?" They personalize the storm almost as if he had sent it against them spitefully. And they address him not as another available hand in a crisis, but as their leader who needs to do something. They project onto him concern for their well-being and survival, and in the process have emptied themselves of any strength or resource to deal with the storm. These weathered mariners are lost in a storm. Now, these experienced fisher people weren't just surprised by or afraid of a storm. They can't have been, because they've been there and they've done that. This is their profession. The Sea of Galilee was notorious for storms, still is. Every day they ventured out was to engage in some risky business. Neither were they suddenly regretting the fact that they hadn't checked the Weather Channel app for the latest advice before they set out. They knew that storms were normal, and yet here they are, scurrying and screaming. It doesn't make sense. Until one considers that possibly they're afraid of themselves. They've lost their courage. They develop some sort of dependency, which happens in all of our relationships. They develop this dependency on their leader and with the relationships they have with one another. And they lost their ability to think, to decide, to act when the storm hit. And panic ensues. Theologian Walter Wink is helpful with this comment. He says, this group of people awoke Jesus with reproaches, not the cry for help. They instead yell, "You, Jesus, you deal with the storm. You're the expert here. You have the resources. You have the experience. You're failing to use them. Get up and do something." I think it's helpful if we remember that this story, like all stories in the spiritual tradition, didn't need to have happened to be true. It's not about the details. It's not about the storm or the boat or the man in the boat. It's not about the storm's beginning or the end. The fact that it came up suddenly or died away as suddenly. It's not about some kind of miracle of a storm obeying Jesus' commands. It's not about any of that. This story, like all spiritual stories, is not about these characters at all. These stories are about us. This story is about you. This story is about me. So here's what's interesting. The point of this story is shown to us by showing us the opposite. As so often happens, we see the truth of the positive through the enlightenment of the negative. Here we have a group of people who can't figure out what they're afraid of, are relying on one person to do what they need to do, and who forget that they've got resources to make decisions and take actions. Which means that this story is prompting us with 4 very vital questions. It's prompting us to confront our fears, to forget our dependency, to remember that we have resources, and to take action. While these folk were probably afraid to death in this moment, they were also terrified of life. And this is the warning of this story. They'd given up their courage by entering into dependency on someone else, and so they experienced the storm not as a challenge, but as a threat that they couldn't do anything about. Our world is full of threats that we can't do anything about if we think of them as such. But if they're simply a storm that we've weathered before, and where we must confront our fears and forget our dependencies and remember we have resources within so that we can take action, they're not so much a threat that we can't do anything about anymore. Check this out, people. This is interesting. The Gospel of Thomas, which didn't make it into the Bibles that we all have lying around, the reasons of which are mostly political and religious fear, by the way, but that's a topic for another time. The Gospel of Thomas says this: if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. Boy, I wish that made it in. That is fantastic. That's an amazing piece of wisdom. If you bring forth what's within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you don't, that same thing within you will destroy you. We all have resources within us: inner strength, inner wisdom, to intuition, a real sense of what is right for us, what is wrong for us, convictions, values. We call it so many things. We've got these resources within us that gives us a certain strength. And when the storms of life come rocking, these, when utilized, will save us. They are what helps us to grab the bucket and start bailing. Our failure to make use of all of that, forgetting ourselves, forgetting the very sacredness of our being and the strength we find here, leads to our what? Cowering in fear. Leads to our overdependence on others to do something about this problem. Leads to being swayed by any who would introduce a challenge to us as a fear. It's been suggested that when social energy flows more toward hope, we find ourselves supporting policies that are more generous, more oriented toward establishing peace and justice. On the other hand, when social energy flows more toward fear, we find ourselves supporting policies that seek to dominate others, to build institutions based on the assumption that there's not enough to go around. So we must save and protect and keep others out. That was written by Michael Lerner in 2006, long before any of the current major issues that we're now struggling came on the scene. The good news is, there's always good news, the world can be reimagined and can be transformed, one person at a time. I think the spiritual wisdom that we hear coming to us from our own Jesus tradition is that transformation and that reimagining of our world from fear to hope does not happen with political candidates. It doesn't happen within our political and economic system. It doesn't happen with legal decisions and laws. You can't legislate against fear. Those all come, and those all happen, but not before the more challenging work of encouraging one heart at a time to change, to soften. It doesn't happen before the more challenging work of recognizing fear for the empty threat that it can be, and fight it with compassion, with generosity, with the hard work of building bridges and relationships that help us, as Marie Curie has said, to understand more so that we may fear less. This is the work of transformation, and that's what the spiritual life is about. We have the power and the strength and the resources to combat the constant messages and persuasions of fear. It is easy for us to get discouraged because we cannot do it on such a public stage as those who are espousing the fear have. Yet, as so many parts of our own history show us, real change happens when a whole bunch of little things transpire. We have that power in little decisions we make every day. To respond with love, to stand up and call hate for what it is, to speak against any and every voice or hint or joke or policy or post or tweet or action or move that pushes toward fear. And say no. The power is in each and every decision we make. What kind of material do we have before us every day? What are we presenting ourselves with? If it's all fear, perhaps we need to consider changing the material in front of our eyeballs. And it happens with how we respond to that and how we respond to each other. And when the storm comes, we don't start yelling at each other to grab the bucket and start bailing, but we start doing what we can do. Now, what's beautiful about community is that we rehearse it here with each other. We rehearse the alternative ways to living with each other. That we create a culture of a new normal, of love and acceptance, of personal and inner spiritual strength in order that we weather the storms. And when we do that with each other, we strengthen ourselves so that we can take it to wherever we need to go next. If it was just about hearing some wisdom from some ancient texts and some modern authors and hearing someone go on and on about it, we could do that from our homes in our pajamas with a computer in front of us. The reason why we're here is because we hear this wisdom and we start rehearsing it with one another. And that's the way we start having impact in our other relationships, in our other worlds, in our online connections, in our families, in our groups of friends, because we take what we've rehearsed, what we've practiced, and we live it. The words we say at a memorial service are so meaningful to me that we can say that love is what lasts forever, and so the Spirit is never gone. Our loving is not just our love, my friends. It's the love of every person who's ever loved us and every love we've ever loved. And when we share that love with one another, we impact the world and we keep spirits of our ancestors alive. We sang a song earlier that had the last line. Do you remember it? It probably took some of you off guard. It said, I'm finding it. Make me a channel of deep peace in giving to all that we receive. It's in dying that we're born to eternal life. And you thought, oh, I didn't think we sung things like that around here. But I'll tell you what. The love of all we've loved and the love of all who've loved us continues in us. And it's how we live eternally. By sharing love, fear has no power over that. So may we work to make the storms in our lives a little calmer, and maybe more importantly, may we make the storm of someone else just a little calmer by the love we share. May we do it in so many ways because we are so many of us in the spirit of love. May it be so.